The format of this session will be, I will invite Mr. Paul Eimon to talk about International Week. He is representing International Week and Panhandle IB Forum. After that, Dr. Miller will introduce our speaker. Paul?
The Panhandle International Business Forum has been working with the Dr. Anwar and the business school here at West Texas for what, 3-4 years now. And it's been a mutually beneficial association in the development of speakers, of seminars, of programs of interest, especially to business students at West Texas A&M University. Pleasure to be here. I won't say much because I've heard Consul Pickens speak last night and this morning, and I want to reserve all the time for his astute comments on trade with Great Britain. I do want to point out that this is part of International Week, which is various organizations, particularly the International Club, Amarillo Public Library, a series of other groups, the AUW, and our International Business Forum, has helped to present this week, focusing on a particular country every year for 1 week. I have a handful of the programs here. There are several more programs this week that you may be interested in. If you don't have this program, please ask me for one after the program. I'm going to turn the program over to Dr. Jerry Miller, who will introduce our speaker today.
Thank you. It's indeed my pleasure to introduce Peter Bacon to you, and I'm tickled to death that we have such a good crowd for him today. He has been in the British diplomatic service for 23 years. He served in places like Brussels, Beirut, Washington, D.C., and Johannesburg, and many other cities that I can't pronounce the names very well, so I'm just going to leave them all. And he's been in Houston for the last year, basically, and his territory includes Texas, Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Colorado. And today he's going to present a topic, doing business with Scotland and the United Kingdom. So let's give a warm welcome to Peter Bacon.
Thank you very much indeed. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As I said last night, I always seem to have heard of Amarillo since childhood, I suppose, because of some good country music and some mediocre Western movies. And I always wanted to visit, and it's very nice to be here. And I'm tremendously impressed by the way you played on all this wet weather for me. Makes me feel quite homesick. When I spoke last night to the International Club, the theme was modern Britain and diplomacy, and that was a nice broad brush theme that I quite like to use because it gives me the opportunity to work in anything that comes to mind as I go along. Today's subject, doing business with Scotland, is by contrast much narrower, but I nevertheless still need to provide some general background, and for those of you who were there last night, I apologize to the extent that this duplicates what I said last night, but it's only the first bit of it, and it's really my essential message as I travel around this vast consular district of mine. I say that because I feel it's essential to dispel some of the myths that still exist, that Britain is a land of thatched cottages, castles, and beefeaters, and dare I say it, marital problems in certain prominent families. Or at least that image needs to be placed in the right perspective. Okay, is that all right? Can you still hear me? I'd be the last one to deny that the traditions of pomp and ceremony, Westminster Abbey, Edinburgh Castle, stately homes, all exist, and we're immensely proud of our royal family. What's left of it? The Queen, I think one really has to separate the Queen and her generation from the marital problems. Someone described the day as D-Day and Divorce Day just now. The Queen has just celebrated her 70th birthday. She exerts a powerful influence on the leadership of the country outside the ebb and flow of day-to-day politics, and she is immensely respected abroad, so she's unique in that sense, and I think it's a great asset to our country to have the royal family and to have the monarch playing that role, provides what we call in cricket a long stop. I don't know what the baseball equivalent of that is. And the history and tradition of Britain contribute importantly, of course, to the quality and way of life in Britain. They provide a depth to our culture, which many of you share historically. And more prosaically, they contribute to our tourist trade. Britain is now the 6th leading tourist destination of the world. But central as these traditional aspects are to the fabric of our society, there's very much more to modern Britain as the enterprise centre of Europe, and to Scotland as the preeminent high-tech centre of Europe. And I'll be going into that in more detail. Silicon Glen, as it's now known, manufactures 40% of all personal computers in Europe. Our economy, thanks in many but not all respects to the then Mrs. Thatcher's reforms, has been transformed. And I could present you with a whole range of statistics, but I thought I'd instead dwell on two key indicators. Firstly, the success of British companies in the global market today, and secondly, where foreign investors are putting their money. On the companies, RTZ, fairly well known in this part of the States, is now the world's largest mining company by far. Glaxo Wellcome is the world's largest pharmaceutical. We have the world's second largest aerospace industry after America. We lead Europe undoubtedly in information technology and telecommunications, as well as high-tech manufacturing. I would inject there that it's not just manufacturing. The use of personal computers in Britain is the highest in the world today. If you want the figures, it's quite staggering. 1 in 3 households in Britain have a personal computer in it. In Europe, the average is 1 in 5.5. In America, it's 1 in 6.5. So we have twice as many in households as you do per capita. 1/3 of Europe's biotechnologies companies are based in Britain. Telecommunications, British Telecom, which owns 20% of MCI, is 2.5 times bigger than MCI. A British company has 90% of the US market for virtual reality. What you think of as Virtual Reality Inc. is actually Virtual Reality Limited, British company. On pharmaceuticals, John Zabriskie, the chairman of Pharmacia and Upjohn here in the States, just very recently described London as the centre of the globe in terms of the pharmaceutical industry. In the financial sector, London's foreign exchange market is larger than New York and Tokyo combined. We're the largest international bank lenders, more than twice as big as the whole of the United States. The British Bank, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, doesn't sound very British, but it certainly is, has recently moved into #1 position as the world's largest bank, bigger than any of those Japanese banks we keep hearing about. Partly a factor of the depreciation of the yen. So we have many world-class and world-leading companies. What about the second criterion, where are foreign businesses investing their money? Again, the answer is unequivocal. 40% of all US and Japanese investment in Europe is in the United Kingdom, as well as about 60% of Taiwanese and Korean investment. Now, I'll go on to discuss the Scottish part of that, which is the main thing, in more detail later. But in the United Kingdom as a whole, there are now over 4,500 US companies, including 99 of the Fortune 100. The United States has more investments in Britain than in Germany, France, the Netherlands, and Italy combined. There are many reasons for that. Britain has one of the lowest main corporate tax rates in the European Union. Only Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, is lower. We've been free of exchange controls since as long ago as 1979. First thing Margaret Thatcher did. There are therefore no controls at all on remittance of profits. Labour costs are significantly below other European countries, and still surprising to some, man hours lost per worker in Britain are the lowest in the industrialised world, and they have been since the early 1980s. Yet people still think there has been a strike there. It's not been the case for a good 15 years. Labour regulations are liberal and undemanding. English is the international language of business, as you know. British government is absolutely committed to reducing regulatory and administrative burdens on business with business-friendly, the most business-friendly government in Europe. Our domestic market is the second largest in Europe, with direct access to the world's largest free trade area, the European Economic Area, not to be confused with the European Union. It's the European Union plus a number of non-union countries, mainly Scandinavian, which provides a market of 380 million consumers with completely free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. The opening of the Channel Tunnel for freight has reduced transit times dramatically. New rail terminals have been or are being built throughout the UK, specifically to serve the rail-only tunnel. Trains loaded at those terminals pass directly under the channel to destinations throughout the rest of Europe with no road transfers, no delays, and some 200 freight trains a week are now going through the tunnel. If that's not enough, Britain appeals to foreign investors because it has a large number of affordable sites. It offers a wide range of business and financial services. It has a familiar and established framework of business law and practice. It's the best country in Europe to raise new capital, without doubt. And it offers a range of grants and incentives that are as good as any on offer elsewhere in Europe, and better than that. So that's the general picture in the United Kingdom. A strong economy, the strongest recovery since 1992 of any major European country. According to the OECD, likely to be easily the fastest growing European economy in both 1996 and 1997. Our forecast growth rate of 3.5% for next year is only being held back by disappointing growth in our continental European export markets. So where does Scotland feature in all this? Well, Scotland is different to the rest of the United Kingdom in many ways. Notably, its legal system is quite separate. It has its own separate court and courts of session. The Church of Scotland is independent of the Church of England. Scotland has its own banks and banknotes and, of course, a distinct cultural identity, as well as spectacularly unique scenery. And of all the regions, Scotland is in many ways the most interesting. Its links with the United States are very strong. Historically, of course, the Scots have always travelled and emigrated widely, and Scottish societies abound in the United States. But today there's also a very strong economic link. That's particularly notable with Texas, for obvious energy-related reasons. The impetus for that comes from the North Sea, and latterly oil and gas activity in the so-called Atlantic frontier, which is west of Scotland, west of Shetland, as it's known. Deep water, hostile water, conditions very similar to the Gulf of Mexico, deep water Gulf of Mexico, thrust that's taking place at the moment. All the major US and oil companies have extensive interests offshore. Scotland and British oil companies have massive interests in the United States. British Petroleum, I know it hurts, is now the major oil and gas producer in domestic US, followed by Shell. Houston is indisputably the oil and gas capital of the world these days. I know that must hurt up here, but there's no getting away from it. There's hardly a major project that's not handled out of Houston anywhere in the world. And British suppliers of equipment and services attach great importance to establishing close links with the project offices there to try and ensure that their products are specified. And And evidence of this, as I mentioned last night, is in the strength of the Houston Grampian Association. Grampian is the region around Aberdeen, which has nearly 700 business members, which was awarded the Reader's Digest Sister Cities of the Year Award in 1994, and is very active and very effective. And by the huge interest of British companies in the offshore technology conference every May. This year, over 120 British companies had officially supported stands at the OTC, and there were then many others there independently. Our Minister for Trade, Lord Fraser, who himself is a notable Scot, attended the first 3 days of the exhibition. There are almost 1,000 British businessmen in town, and most of those had distinct Scottish accents. But Scotland these days is much more than oil and gas and Scotch whisky, important as all those items are. The key new industry, steadily supplanting engineering and shipbuilding, is electronics. Scotland, as I've said, is now the largest producer of computer and IT-related hardware in Europe, as well as 40% of Europe's personal computers. It manufactures more than 50% of all automatic telling machines in Europe, and a third of Europe's biotechnology companies based in Britain, and a substantial portion of those are up in Scotland. One of the reasons for their success is there has been Scotland's ability to attract foreign investment. Nearly 250 of those 4,500 companies I mentioned earlier, 250 are in Silicon Glen, and 35 from Japan. Those US manufacturers include compact computers, IBM, Motorola, Digital, Sun Microsystems, Tandem, and PCI. Japanese company NEC is currently building an 800 million semiconductor plant. Compaq have just added a further 300 employees to their printed circuit board plant. Just last month, 2 Taiwanese companies, Lite-On Technology Corporation, which is now the world's 5th largest computer monitor manufacturer, and Chunghwa Picture Tubes announced their further $500 million worth of new investment for 4,500 jobs. Scotland offers all the attractions which I mentioned earlier in relation to Britain as a whole as a destination for foreign investment. It also has a mature and well-capitalized financial sector centered on Edinburgh. We talked earlier about the involvement of British capital in the development of Texan branches in the last century, and an enormous amount of that came out of Edinburgh. Excellent transportation facilities, good motorways, trunk roads, 4 international airports now at Glasgow, Edinburgh, Prestwick, and Aberdeen. Direct flights to several major cities in the United States and to almost every city throughout Europe. Hourly shuttle services to London from both Edinburgh and Glasgow. So despite being the northernmost region in the UK, it's by no means isolated from the rest of Europe. There are several, for those of you thinking of investment or interested in investment, there are a number of so-called assisted areas in Scotland where some of the best UK grants can be obtained. Details of those can be obtained either from the Invest in Britain Bureau or the regional investment organisation located in Scotland, which has a representative by the name of Jim Haggerty, based in Houston, and I'd obviously be very happy to give you details both of Invest in Britain Bureau and located in Scotland. There are also two major Scottish regional development agencies. Scottish Enterprise is one, and the other is the Highlands and Islands Enterprise Board. Now, most of what I've said so far relates to investment in both directions. Although I haven't said much about British investment here. We are the largest investors, as I said, in the United States by a long way. We have about $130 billion Many of those you might think of as being American. They include names like familiar names to you, like Holiday Inn, Burger King, Haagen-Dazs. Smith & Wesson is always the one I like to quote in Texas. Brooks Brothers, if you can afford it, you buy your shirts. It's owned 100% by Marks & Spencer these days. On the trade front, the role of the British Consulate General in Houston is to promote British exports to the United States. Responsibility for advising and assisting US exporters to Britain rests with the US Department of Commerce, as well as the US Embassy in London and the US consulates in the UK regions are the mirror image of ourselves. Here, the network of British Consulates General and consulates throughout the states. In Texas, we have a Consulate General in Houston and a consulate in Dallas. And then I have career consuls in New Orleans and Denver. Did I say career consuls? I meant honorary consuls in New Orleans and Denver. And what we provide basically is a matchmaking service, putting British exporters in touch with suitable American agents, distributors, end users, as well as ensuring that American buyers are able to identify UK sources of supply for particular products and services. Before I explain how we go about this, I should perhaps say that in all our consulates we employ a mix of UK-based staff, very much a minority. The commercial managers throughout the United States tend to be UK-based staff. Career members of the diplomatic service on assignment here. Together with a much larger number of US-engaged commercial officers and assistants. Now, those US officers are recruited on a contract basis for 3 to 6 years. And invariably they bring with them expertise of a particular sector or type of business. They tend to be youngish Americans, pretty highly qualified, who've been working for a US company and are just basically taking a 3-year sabbatical and go back to their country. We find it works very well indeed. And then overlaying those activities is a system of lead post responsibilities. So Houston, for example, and obviously takes the lead on inquiries about energy, Seattle about aerospace, Detroit about automotives, and so on. A significant proportion of our time is spent on preparing tailor-made market reports, commissioned through the Department of Trade and Industry in the UK by British exporters who are seeking agents for their products or buyers of their products and services, or who simply want to know the best way of marketing their goods here. They pay for these reports, which are produced to a high professional standard these days. And in order to achieve that standard, our commercial officers need to spend a considerable amount of their time in the marketplace, establishing a wide range of contacts within their consular districts. In my case, as you've heard, our consular district is massive. It's Texas, Louisiana, Colorado, Arkansas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. So it's really quite daunting from that point of view, although very enjoyable in other points of view. In addition to writing specific reports, our officers also meet British businessmen visiting the United States and provide briefings and contacts for them. We handle a large number of British trade missions to the US every year, and we assist British companies exhibiting in exhibitions and trade fairs here. As part of their field work, our officers, as well as getting to know the market, are constantly seeking to identify American companies interested in acting as agents for British companies as well as end users. US companies like yours, for those of you who are in business, who are seeking sources of supply from the UK can use free of charge through our commercial officers and consulates our computerized export intelligence service, which sends details of your requirements to those British companies that have registered an interest in supplying the market. In addition, we also have a wide range of information about British products and services in our commercial section, libraries, both in the form of directories and CD-ROM, much more the latter these days. I brought with me a supply of brochures describing those services in more detail and telling you how to get hold of us if you do have any inquiries. We hope very much that you will. So that's a thumbnail sketch of Britain, a modern, business-friendly economy, attracting foreign investors in droves, a brief description of how we can help you import our goods and services. As I've said, it's for the US government services to advise you on how to export to Britain. Although it's not my function to advise you on that for that reason, I thought that what I might do, because I'm conscious that most of you are actually much more interested in exporting than importing, to let you have one or two tips from the summer 1996 edition, just published, of a magazine from the British American Chamber of Commerce in New York, called UK and the USA. And they laid out 10 commandments to US exporters, with an introduction debunking the theory that if it's good for the US market, it's going to be good anywhere else, particularly in the UK, because people speak the same language. And they describe how even the mighty have stumbled and fallen with those words ringing in their ears. This article, I emphasize, is written by an American management consultant. And it describes how the UK can be the most treacherous market of all, because exporters are lulled into a false sense of complacency by this supposed common language. They quote, for example, a well-known, I did have the name in there, but I thought I'd better take it out, a well-known Tex-Mex fast food chain. You can work that out. Which discovered against all its expectations that the British did not have the same appetite for fast Mexican food as they do for Chinese and Indian cuisine. And they describe how a US pharmaceutical giant, beginning with M, was driven back from the market by surprisingly fierce competition. And yet they say there's never been a better time to try than now, mainly because of the strength of the economy. And that things American are increasingly popular in Britain. I thought they always had been, but this is what the article says. US exports to the UK rose to $28.8 billion last year, which compares with $22 billion in 1991. So your exports are strong and healthy. Many of the 10 commandments apply to most markets, and I don't really have the time to quote extensively, but they're just one or two extracts. For those of you who are students here who haven't heard of this before, I'm sure, the importance of doing your homework, being your own devil's advocate. Ask as many questions as possible. Along the way, they say, you may have to jettison some cherished financial ratios. Many US-based retailers are staggered at the cost and long lease terms of high street property prices in the UK, which can run at double or more the rates for a comparable US location. As for all markets, they emphasize the importance of finding the right partners and honoring the local culture. We say the same thing the other way around. The language, you'll all have heard the aphorism, two countries divided by a common language. They emphasize too that the British culture is different. I would add to that even more different in Scotland. And understanding British attitudes, motivations, tastes and preferences will spell the difference between success and failure. And whilst you shouldn't underestimate the competition, like this well-known Tex-Mex fast food chain, nor should you overestimate it either. There are always niches in any market, and some of those are quite large. They quote, and because this is favourable, I can give you the name, they quote Landmark Express, which is part of the AIG insurance group. And they were investigating quite recently, about 2 years ago, I think, the launch of a direct market car insurance line in the UK. And they quickly discovered that the competition was powerful, as it is, and that it enjoys an extraordinary degree of customer loyalty in Britain. But digging deeper, they discovered that there was a huge underserved market, and that arises because 2/3 of new cars in the UK are bought by companies, cars being a major executive perk in Britain. And Landmark discovered that a mainly retired group of over 50s, whose auto insurances had previously been covered by their employers, had difficulty in finding economic insurance rates because they hadn't earned no-claim discounts, which are terribly important in Britain. You normally run on a 60% no-claim discount. And they didn't have that because they hadn't built up any long-term relations with with insurers. Now, Landmark, I mean, why a British insurance company didn't discover that, I don't know, but Landmark saw that gap. And in the first 6 months of operating in the UK, they took 20% of the business from the established market leaders. Thus, the conclusion is research, research, research. On the other hand, they quote an example of a major US healthcare corporation. It was actually Baxter's, who didn't do their research. They were trying to sell a disposable tool to primary care physicians, what we call general practitioners in the UK. In the US, the PCPs routinely take samples of spinal fluid when patients complain of lower back pain. Now, this is done in the US, believe it or not, to protect doctors from subsequent malpractice suits. The reason they couldn't sell this product in Britain is that the threats of lawsuits just don't exist in the same way as they do here. It took them a long while to find that out, and they lost a lot of money before they pulled out of the UK. And basic market research would obviously have prevented that mistake, and there are many highly competent UK market research companies to call upon. Another thing they'll tell you, according to this article, is that telemarketing is nowhere near as effective in the UK as in the US, and I would certainly agree with that. British buyers attach much more importance to personal business. And remember too, and this comes as something of a surprise, that the UK's national media is unquestionably more powerful than in the US. The combined circulation of national daily newspapers is about 20 million copies, which is about 6 times greater than the readership for national papers in the US. The distribution system in the UK is also very different to the US. 5 supermarket chains have 80% of the food sales in the UK. But it's the most efficient and profitable in the world. Now, you'd obviously need professional advice to get into those chains successfully. And finally, they say, you find that overnight success, common in the United States, is very rare in the United Kingdom. According to one prominent market research company, overestimating the pace for customers to accept new business entrants, both culturally and commercially, is a very common trap for US businessmen. You can plan on roughly twice the time to get a new product established in the UK compared with the United States. Similarly, there's less short-termism than in the US, and the key, as elsewhere, is learning to build trust and solid relationships. And you're warned too that you will have to be patient about profits. I would add to that from my own experience, and it's interesting in this as in many other contexts, coming back to the United States after living here for 4 or 5 years in the early 80s, I'm very struck by the difference between the quality of consumer goods in the UK and Europe generally and the United States. Ours are very, very, very much higher. Things aren't made to last here. I've spoken far too long, I think, so let me stop there. As I've indicated, my commercial staff and I would be very happy to advise further in whatever way we can, and I'd be very happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
questions for Mr. Bacon? Sorry.
Mr. Bacon, several times in your speech you alluded to the fact that the culture, the attitude, the preferences are very different. Could you elaborate a little bit on something more specifically? People come from here to talk, what kind of things they should talk, not talk, how should they conduct negotiating, those kinds of things.
Is that working?
We can hear you well.
Is that working? Is that working?
Yeah.
I heard a presentation recently. We organised a seminar in Houston under the auspices of the British American Business Association on investing in Britain. And there was a very interesting presentation by a chap who's quite a senior executive with Enron now, who set up the Enron plant. They've got a huge cogeneration plant, T-side, 50-50 joint venture with ICI. It's the biggest cogeneration plant in the world. And he was talking about the difference in the business culture when he went there 6 years ago to set that up. And he emphasized the lead times, the difference in particularly in the time it takes to reach decisions. You know, the British like to mull it over days on end and hopefully get it right, you know, whereas the Americans really want to get it done quickly, and if it's wrong, they move on to the next, but usually it's right. More than anything else, he said that was the difference that he noticed. Culturally, I mean, I suppose I think the differences can be exaggerated. I think we talk about differences in the culture and the English language and so on just because they're surprising. You know, 99% of everything's exactly the same. You just get caught out by the differences because you're not expecting them. I don't think there are a lot of examples I could give you. It's just to be on the watch out. As always, as we say everywhere in the world, the right partners are essential. Get your local knowledge from having the right agents or the right joint venture partners. Increasingly, our work is to do with strategic alliances, putting people in touch with each other so they don't stumble and fall over these unexpected hurdles.
Thank you.
You mentioned that quality is much higher in the UK and in Europe than in the US. To what do you attribute that?
I would put it down to a certain insularity. I would, if you want, you know, a frank opinion, which I'm sure you do, whether you agree with it or not. I think I'm slightly unusual in that I lived in the States in the early 80s, and I've come back to it. Britain has changed so dramatically since the early 80s. Margaret Thatcher had only been in power for a few months when I arrived. So Britain has changed. And in many of these areas, Britain and Europe have overtaken the US. The US seems to have stood still. When I came here in the early 80s, everything here was better. You know, the supermarkets were unbelievable and so on. We didn't really have anything like that. Now they're bigger and they're better. My local supermarket has 55 checkout counters and that sort of thing. The quality of the food is very much higher. If you want to buy anything here now, let me give you some personal examples. We've just extended our kitchen in our residence in Houston. Massive job. And we've completely fitted it out with appliances. You cannot go to an appliance supplier in the States who will not recommend if you can afford it. And I can afford it because the British government is paying. An imported one. You know, if you want something that you want, a washing machine or a dishwasher, anything that's going to last, they're always certified Bosch, or not necessarily British, but buy imported. And almost everything we bought here is inferior. And I think it's got a lot to do with the sorts of things one hears increasingly from the extreme right in the House of Representatives, for example, on import protection. There are underlying protectionist trends here that are extremely worrying, and I think very counterproductive and lead to huge misunderstandings about the effects of NAFTA, for example, and the effects of allowing import exports into the country, and just making American companies more competitive. And I think you're at the early stages now of being shut out of world markets in many sectors, consumer goods particularly. I was playing, I mean, and it's not that it's cheap. I heard a chap on one of these DJs on the talk show host the other day talking about the shoddy quality of imported goods in America and how awful that is, what's happened to all the good American products 20 years ago when you made it all yourself. I had a wonderful, tiny example of how untrue that is, because I have a 7-year-old grandson living with me, and I was making a model plane with him just 2 nights ago. And it was terrible when we bought it. It was manufactured by Revell, which is a US company. And it was appalling, the bits didn't come off properly, everything was wrong with it. And I was moaning about this, and we'd never buy one of these again. And he said, well, we've already got one. And he went upstairs and bought down another packet, Revell, exactly the same US company. We compared the packets. One I bought in England when I was last on holiday, and one I bought here, and they were both manufactured in Germany, imported into the US by Revell in Germany. And one had the European standard, consumer standard logo on the side, and the US one didn't. And there was no comparison whatsoever. Now that's a US company manufacturing shoddy goods in Germany for sale in the US market, and to a much higher standard for sale in the European market. It's a tiny example, but I think if you reflect on it, you'll find a lot of truth in that. NAFTA in particular, attitudes to NAFTA worry me enormously. And NAFTA has actually provided 100,000 new American jobs, and all you hear is about, exported jobs to Mexico.
I guess I was wondering if perhaps the consumers in Europe and Great Britain are much more demanding than what the U.S. consumers are. If we accept that shoddy merchandise, obviously, they'll make it themselves. Apparently, consumers over there won't accept that.
No, that's right. They won't. And the after-sales service is better. If you want something repaired, it's repaired immediately. I mean, here it goes off to the depths of Montana or somewhere. You never see it for another 6 weeks if at all. No, I think the consumers are much more demanding, and I think the consumer associations are much more effective. One hears a lot about them. So they don't seem to have the control over quality that they do.
How does corporate earnings Great Britain compare to that of the United States?
I don't know. I suppose I ought to know the answer to that. I don't know the answer. I can only assume, because of the scale of US investment in Britain, that they wouldn't be there if they weren't making decent profits and remitting them. The tax rate the corporate tax rate is lower. There's less of a tax burden. There's less of a regulatory burden in the UK. Labour, as I said, labour costs, and I make a distinction there between labour costs and wage rates. Labour costs are low in Britain. Wages are low in certain areas. Scotland, wages are low. But the cost of labour is low because we don't have the restrictions that the rest of Europe has. So I think they make good money in Britain, but I wouldn't like to guess how that compares. I'll look into that. It's an interesting question.
You were in Johannesburg in South Africa in a very interesting period with Mandela coming into power. Would you give us just some comments on what you think of the present situation there?
Well, it's one always has to be optimistic about South Africa, otherwise nothing would happen there. I was there at a fascinating time. I got there in 1988 when P.W. Botha was still state president, when apartheid was still very much in place, and Mandela was still locked up in Robben Island, and the ANC was still banned and all that, and saw all the changes, which we were very much involved in the British Embassy there. We were in a very paradoxical position because we were seen to be supporting the white regime. We weren't as enthusiastic about sanctions as the rest of the world. And we took that attitude because we felt that the only way to bring about change there was to engage the white regime in some sort of dialogue rather than isolate them totally. The Americans took the opposite view, and I actually think that the combination of those two policies was what brought about change. I mean, I do think sanctions worked in the sense that they forced South African whites to realise just how repugnant their policies were regarded elsewhere, and because it did make life difficult for them economically. I don't think anyone, who arrived in South Africa in the late 80s could have dreamt for one moment that there would be such a dramatic change there. And there was an awful lot that could go wrong, and there still is an awful lot that can go wrong. I think all I can say is that what's happened is really quite beyond anyone's wildest expectations just 5 years ago. And one wishes them every success. What's worrying now is in South Africa is the security again. It's criminal activity is horrendous there. If you think the murder rate is high in U.S. cities, Johannesburg is 10 times higher than any city in the U.S. I could give you the figures on that. For the countries as a whole, the murder rate in Britain is 1 per 100,000 citizens. In the US, it's 9 per 100,000. In South Africa, it's 89 per 100,000. So that's one problem. The other is the economy. The rand has collapsed somewhat in the last couple of months, but it's a country with enormous natural resources and human resources. And I've still got a very small investment there, which I'm keeping.
Do I have this right, but you said that British is the largest direct investment in the United States with $130 billion?
Yes.
I had always thought it was probably Asia or Japan that had the highest investment here. Who comes after?
Japan comes. We were the highest for many years. There was 1 year, and I think it was 1992. It may have been 1993, where Japan was bigger than us. I'm just wondering, it may have been slightly earlier, 91, 92, it was around the early 90s, when there was enormous Japanese investment mainly in property, particularly in Manhattan, that attracted an enormous amount of attention. So there was a short period where Japan was bigger than us, but two things happened. We continued to invest at a higher level, and property prices collapsed, and it really couldn't have happened to nicer people. So we then became number one again. So we're the largest, followed by Japan and Germany. But we're very much bigger, and our investment is good, solid investment. It's 45% of it is in manufacturing.
I have read that 1/3 of Houston is owned by Japanese interests. Have you read that?
No, in what sense?
I don't know.
No. They have our investment in Texas is very, very much larger than the Japanese investment in Texas, and they have slightly more companies than us in Houston, but not many more. We have 350 British companies here in Texas. That's an investment of about $8.5 billion, employing 70,000 Texans.
I was curious to know what is the current position about American Airlines and British Airways alliance, and in context of the fact that British Airways partner here in the U.S., U.S. Air is now suing British Airways because they kind of feel that they were left in the lurch and they went ahead with American Airlines.
Well, it's It's a very topical subject. I read in the Wall Street Journal this morning that the current round of talks, the latest round of talks that were scheduled to take place today and tomorrow, have been broken off by the Americans again. The relationship between British Airways and American Airlines will be what they call a code sharing agreement. It'll be an agreement over ticketing and sales, marketing, that sort of thing. There's no exchange of equity in the way that there is between, well not between, but in the way that British Airways own 25% of US Air. That code sharing agreement needs the blessing of both the American and the American administration and the UK government. It raises all sorts of issues of monopoly and antitrust and all that sort of thing, both here and in the UK and in Europe. So it's going to be investigated by the European Commission, by our Monopolies and Mergers Commission, and by the various authorities in Washington. It would only go ahead if there's a certain easing of the restrictions on transatlantic flights that in particular the American airlines are keen to have relaxed, in particular access to Heathrow Airport. So it's a very complicated issue. It's all caught up to in competition between the US airlines. The other airlines don't want it to go ahead because, of course, they feel squeeze them out of the transatlantic route market. On the other hand, they would like to see some easing in the regulation and have better access to Heathrow Airport. But they are objecting to it, as is Virgin Atlantic on the UK side. There won't be any progress this side of the American election, that's for sure. I'm quite certain that these talks have been postponed and won't be resumed until after the election. The Washington rumour mill has it that there'll be a new transport secretary after the election. It may make things easier. He's not being particularly helpful in this context. But nothing's going to happen. That will not take place whatever happens for another 12 to 18 months. It's going to be a very long, protracted process.
If you're going to project to the next 10 years, could you target an area of focus for foreign investment from the UK and for exporting as the United States, Europe, or Asia?
Well, yeah, that's difficult. It has to be information tech, the whole sort of field of information technology and telecommunications.
But which world region would you be targeting?
The world region.
Yeah, your foreign investment that leaves, into
Right.
the UK, is it going to Asia increasingly,
Sorry,
America
okay.
increasingly, to Europe increasingly?
It's still coming predominantly to the United States. This is still a massive market, and it's been long established here. So there are new major investments announced almost every day of the week here. I mentioned two last night that have just happened. Premier Industrial has just been bought by a British company for nearly $3 billion. And Gates Rubber up in Denver there was bought earlier this year for over $500 million. So it's a continuing process. And of course Europe is we have to invest in Europe because it's a domestic market and we need to serve it, and it is our biggest market. Europe, America's our biggest single market, but Europe is our biggest region market. But otherwise it has to be Asia Pacific, and that's where an awful lot of British money and effort is going these days. I came here from Indonesia. We have an enormous commercial staff in the embassy in Jakarta, doing nothing but help British companies into that market, and a great deal of that does involve equity investment. It's a very small market at the moment, but the World Bank has just forecast it will be the world's sixth largest economy in the year 2010. If you're looking 10 years ahead, that's really got to be where you're looking. India, Indonesia, China, and possibly Brazil.
There are a lot of people who are students here, either in the university or people like me who still study, even if they're not formally enrolled in the university. In the span of your diplomatic career and working with commercial interests, what is the subject that you didn't know anything about that you wish you had studied harder or had known ahead of time? That you had to learn on the job that you might get that.
I think probably a hard language. I think anyone, any American or Brit who is taking an MBA course or something like that, if he or she also learned Japanese or Indonesian is actually very simple, but Japanese or Chinese, their future's made. Our Japanese speakers in our service, the British are terrible linguists, but British diplomats have a reputation for being good linguists. We invest a lot of money in it. Ours is the only embassy in Tokyo where all our diplomats are Japanese speakers. And as they move up through the service, there just aren't enough jobs because we've only got the Tokyo embassy and one or two consulates where they can serve in. So a lot of them get bought out by investment bankers or large British companies, and they will pay them an enormous six-figure salary just on the strength of their fluency in Japanese.
Any other questions? Before we conclude, I want to thank our West Texas faculty, Dr. Long, our president, our business community. But I would like you to know that we were also helped by Syed, Students in Free Enterprise, and there are 500 chapters nationwide, and some of these guys have left their classes, but they helped me in this program. And last year, under the leadership of Professor Gene Walker and Dr. Jerry Miller, this chapter is one of the first 20 in the nation, so it's really good. And again, thank you very much, and we thank Mr. Bacon for his thought-provoking ideas and insightful comments, and we will see you next year. Goodbye.